I welcome you to my channel. Subscribe and listen to my new stories every day. I had always seen my life as pretty straightforward. Karen and I met in college, two young, ambitious kids with dreams of building a life together. Over the next decade, we grew from that young couple, not yet sure of ourselves, into a family of four. We had two beautiful kids, a solid home, and a lifestyle that was comfortable but never extravagant. I was proud of what we'd accomplished. I was proud of her, too. Karen worked in HR for a big corporate office, the kind that keeps people on call at all hours, especially when they're dealing with large teams. It wasn't unusual for her to have to stay late for some emergency. I trusted her, why wouldn't I? We'd been together for so long that I felt certain she was as dedicated to our life as I was. Then, things started to change. Looking back, I can't say there was a specific moment when I knew something was wrong, but gradually, her behavior shifted. She started spending more time at work, staying later than usual, with meetings that seemed endless. At first, I chalked it up to a busy quarter. HR is always under pressure, she'd say, her eyes fixed on her phone as I'd ask her about her day. But even as she shared her work frustrations, there was something she was holding back. It's funny how easy it is to ignore the signs when you don't want to see them. What guy wants to believe his wife is lying to him? So, I kept my suspicions buried, shrugging off the unease gnawing at me. But then, Karen started bringing up a new team lead in her office, Mike. She spoke about him often, more than seemed necessary for someone who was just a colleague. The way her face softened when she mentioned him, how he'd saved the day in some crisis or made her laugh at the end of a rough shift, ate away at me. I still ignored it, telling myself I was just being paranoid. The real trouble started one Saturday afternoon. Karen was getting ready to go out, saying she had to help prepare for an upcoming project launch. Normally, she'd be in her work clothes if it were a work thing, but that day, she was dressed more casually, in a way that felt out of place for the office. She wore a fitted black blouse, her hair curled and styled, with that slight touch of makeup she usually saved for date nights. I tried not to let my mind wander, but there was no avoiding the flicker of doubt as she walked out the door. An hour later, I got a text from a mutual friend who also worked in her office. Saw Karen out at lunch with her team. She's really chummy with that Mike guy. They look close. The message hit me like a punch in the gut. I'd been able to push my suspicions aside until then, but this was too real. I wanted to confront her right then and there, but part of me couldn't. If I was wrong, then what? It would only prove that I'd let my imagination ruin what we had. So, I forced myself to stay calm, hoping that I was just misinterpreting things. That evening, I tried to bring up her workday. She was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, her face set in that all-too-familiar expression of mild disinterest. So, how was the project work? Did Mike and the team pull through? Karen's eyes flicked up from her phone. There was a tiny pause, barely noticeable, but enough for me to feel it. Oh, yeah, it was fine. Mike's always on top of things. She didn't offer any details, which wasn't like her. Normally, she'd be telling me the ins and outs of everything, complaining about her workload or venting about some office drama. This time, she stayed vague, brushed off my questions, and disappeared into the kitchen. That night, I lay awake, replaying the little details, the subtle changes, the excuses. Each one was like a stitch in a pattern I couldn't ignore anymore. The next day, I made a decision. I needed to know what was really going on. I decided to check our joint phone bill for clues, feeling ridiculous and desperate all at once. I told myself it was just a way to ease my mind, but deep down, I knew I was looking for something specific. When I accessed the records, there it was, an unfamiliar number that appeared multiple times. Each call lasted for nearly an hour, always late at night, always on the days she'd said she was working late. My heart sank. It was like watching our life unravel before my eyes. But even then, I told myself it could be innocent. Maybe it was another colleague. Maybe it was just work. The what-ifs held me back, kept me paralyzed. That evening, Karen came home exhausted, or at least that's what she told me. She went straight upstairs, her phone in hand, leaving me in the kitchen. She barely greeted the kids and didn't seem to notice their disappointment. I went up shortly after to check on her, only to find her in our bedroom, scrolling through her messages. I watched her from the doorway, half expecting her to notice me. But she didn't look up, lost in her own world. And in that moment, I decided I needed to know for sure. I went down to the living room, my mind racing. How was I supposed to bring it up? What if I was wrong? What if I just imagined it all, letting my insecurities get the better of me? But then I thought of our kids, of the family we'd built together, and I knew I couldn't let this go without knowing the truth. A few days later, I got my chance. Karen had left her phone on the counter while she went upstairs to get ready for bed. She had set it to silent, but as I went to grab my keys, I saw it light up with a message from that same number. My heart hammered as I opened it. Can't wait to see you again. Tonight was amazing. The words blurred as the weight of what I'd feared sank in. She wasn't working late, and this was no innocent colleague. This was betrayal in its rawest form. I put the phone back and stared at the wall, trying to process what I'd just seen. Every memory, every moment we'd shared, now felt like a lie. My marriage, my family, it was all built on trust that she'd shattered with a single message. I didn't confront her right away. I knew I needed a plan, needed time to wrap my head around what was happening. But as I walked away that night, a quiet resolve settled over me. She might have lied to me, but I wasn't going to be the one left reeling. I had a plan to make sure she'd understand exactly what she'd thrown away, and I was ready to go all in. In the days that followed, I moved through life like a ghost. Every interaction, every word exchanged between us felt different, tainted. Karen was still Karen, same smile, same laugh, same everything, but I saw her through new eyes now. Every gesture felt calculated, every explanation rehearsed. I told myself to keep my cool, to gather my evidence and stick to the plan. But as each day passed, the urge to confront her burned stronger. She kept up her routine, unaware of my suspicions. She'd wake up early to get the kids ready, give me a peck on the cheek, and rush off to work with that same carefree smile. I found myself studying her, memorizing the way she laughed at breakfast or glanced back at me before heading out the door. It was surreal, the way she could play the part so well, as though nothing had changed between us. One evening, as I helped our son with his homework, Karen sat across from us, her phone in her hand, that subtle smile tugging at her lips. She looked up at me and for a split second, I thought I saw a flicker of something, maybe guilt, maybe doubt, but she quickly looked away. The feeling in my gut grew heavier, and I knew I couldn't let this go on much longer. I needed proof that would leave no room for doubt, no wiggle room for excuses. So I started planning my moves. I'd done my research online, reading up on how to track a phone, recover deleted messages, and other digital sleuthing tricks. It wasn't something I ever imagined myself doing, but the betrayal changed everything. I needed concrete evidence. Not just for me, but for the family we'd built, the life I thought was real. If she was going to walk away, I was going to make sure she knew exactly what she destroyed. That weekend, I waited until Karen left for one of her work meetings to access her laptop. She'd been getting careless, leaving it unlocked, her emails open. My fingers hovered over the trackpad, nerves racking me as I searched through her inbox. Most of it was routine work stuff, and for a brief moment, I wondered if I'd imagined it all. But then, hidden in a folder titled Travel, I found what I'd been looking for. Emails. Dozens of them, exchanged with Mike. At first, they were professional, polite even, but as I scrolled further down, the tone shifted. There were inside jokes, late-night messages, comments about next time, and subtle hints that no coworkers would ever use. My blood boiled with each word. It wasn't just an affair, it was a full-blown relationship, and she was planning her life around him right under my nose. One email caught my attention. It was from just last week, a message confirming a reservation at a restaurant I didn't recognize. Looking forward to our next escape, she'd written, a playful wink emoji added at the end. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. This was all I needed, but the ache in my chest was growing sharper with every detail I uncovered. I printed the emails, stored them away in a file, and closed her laptop as if nothing had happened. When she returned home that night, I watched her like I was seeing her for the first time. She was warm, affectionate, even eager to catch up on our day. It was all a game to her. She could come home and act like the perfect wife, knowing full well she was keeping someone else on the side. I wondered how long she'd planned to keep this charade going, if she'd ever intended to come clean or if she expected me to never find out. The next day, I sat her down and suggested we go out for dinner. She seemed surprised, even delighted, saying we hadn't gone out just the two of us in a while. I could see the spark of excitement in her eyes, the same excitement she probably felt for him. It took every ounce of strength to keep a steady smile and play my part. We'd go out to dinner, all right. But it wouldn't be the kind of evening she expected. I made reservations at a place we'd loved in our early years together, a small, quiet restaurant on the edge of town. When we arrived, she slipped her arm through mine, flashing me that familiar smile. I tried not to let my bitterness show, but my heart raced as I mentally prepared for what I was about to do. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the point of no return. We ordered wine, our favorite dishes, and as the evening went on, I let her do most of the talking. She filled the silence with stories from work, funny anecdotes about her coworkers. I even heard her mention Mike, describing him as such a help at the office, like she'd done so many times before. I watched her carefully, waiting for the right moment. After our meal, I leaned back in my chair, setting my glass down slowly. She looked at me, smiling, waiting for me to speak. So, Karen, I said, keeping my tone casual. I've been meaning to ask you about work lately. You seem to be spending a lot of time with Mike. She blinked, surprised, but quickly composed herself. Oh, yeah, he's been really helpful. You know, just keeps things running smoothly. Must be a good guy then, I replied. Seems like you two spend a lot of late nights working on projects together. The smile faded from her face as she searched my expression, probably wondering where this was going. What are you getting at? I'm just curious, I said, my tone still neutral. Because I looked through our phone records, Karen. And let's just say, the number of late-night calls between you and this Mike guy is interesting. Her face turned pale, and she set her glass down slowly. You went through my phone records. Why wouldn't I? I asked, my voice growing colder. I mean, we're married, right? We're supposed to be a team. But it looks like you're off building your own life with Mike. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. I watched her struggle to find an excuse, some way to backtrack or deny it, but there was no point. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the printed emails, sliding them across the table. These are just the highlights, I said. There's more where that came from. Do you have anything to say? She stared at the papers, her hands trembling as she skimmed through them. I could see the panic in her eyes, the fear that she'd lost control of the situation. For the first time, she looked vulnerable, like the weight of her lies was crushing her. I don't know what to say, she whispered, barely meeting my eyes. Say the truth, I replied. Tell me why you thought you could keep this going and still come home every night, pretending to be my wife. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she looked away, covering her mouth as if to stifle a sob. But I didn't feel sympathy. I'd spent weeks in torment, watching her lie to my face, and now that she was finally caught, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was just lonely, and he was there for me." "Lonely?" I repeated, laughing bitterly. "You could have talked to me, Karen. We could have worked through it. Instead, you chose to betray me. To lie to me, to our kids." She buried her face in her hands, shaking as the guilt and shame set in. But it wasn't enough. The pain she'd caused, the destruction she'd wrought on our family, couldn't be undone with a simple apology. I stood up, tossing enough money on the table to cover our bill. "You can keep those," I said, nodding to the emails in her trembling hands. "And don't expect me to come back tonight. I need some time away from all this." She reached out, her voice cracking. "Please, wait, we can fix this, can't we?" I paused, looking down at her, the woman I'd loved and trusted with my whole heart. But the truth was, I didn't recognize her anymore. And in that moment, I realized there was no going back. I left her at the table that night, barely able to look back as she sat there, stunned and broken. The satisfaction I'd expected didn't come, only a dull ache that reminded me of how hollow this all felt. I drove around aimlessly for hours, the city lights blurring as I replayed every detail, every choice, and every word I could have said but didn't. Each memory I had of her, of our life together, felt as if it had a shadow now, a sharp edge where there once had been comfort. Eventually, I pulled into a hotel for the night. My phone buzzed repeatedly, each text from Karen a mix of apologies, pleas, and fragmented explanations that only made the hole inside me feel wider. She wanted to talk, to explain herself, but what was left to explain? The facts were out in the open. Any words now would be too little, too late. The next morning, I drove home, determined to keep my composure, if only for the kids. They'd been with Karen's sister overnight, so at least they hadn't witnessed the fallout. But as I opened the door to our house, I was hit with an overwhelming sense of betrayal. Our home, the space we'd built together, where every room held memories of laughter, fights, and love, now felt like a stage where she'd orchestrated her lies. Karen was there, waiting for me in the kitchen, still in the clothes she'd worn the night before. Her face was drawn, eyes swollen, and she looked like she hadn't slept a second. For a moment, I felt a twinge of pity, but I pushed it aside. She'd made her choices. Now, we both had to live with them. "Good morning," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She looked up, her gaze full of desperation. "Thank you for coming home. I know this is hard, but we need to talk. For the kids, if nothing else." I folded my arms, leaning against the counter, not ready to let her off easily. "Talk, then," I replied, my tone cold and flat. "I'm listening." She hesitated, wringing her hands as she fumbled for the right words. "I know what I did was wrong, unforgivable. And I don't expect you to understand, but I need you to know that it was never about us. It was. I was feeling lost, and Mike, he was there. He made me feel wanted." "Wanted?" I repeated, the word bitter on my tongue. "You think I didn't want you, Karen? You think I wasn't committed to you every single day? I gave you everything I had, and you threw it all away for someone who barely knows you." Tears streamed down her face, and she reached for me, but I stepped back, putting distance between us. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," she said, her voice breaking. "It was just something I thought would help me feel alive again. But it spiraled, and I didn't know how to stop it. I kept telling myself I'd end it, that I'd come back to you completely, but I was in too deep." "In too deep?" I echoed, struggling to keep my voice steady. "You were already in deep when you chose to lie to my face, night after night. Do you even realize how much damage you've done? Not just to me, but to the life we built, to our family?" She wiped her face, nodding, but her silence told me everything. She hadn't thought of anyone but herself, hadn't considered the ripple effects of her betrayal. I couldn't tell if she was remorseful or just sorry for getting caught, and in that moment, I wasn't sure I cared. "Look," I said, my voice growing colder, "this isn't just about what you did. It's about the person you became to do it. You were my wife, my partner. We were supposed to face life together, to share our fears, our doubts. Instead, you went behind my back, chose someone else, and made a mockery of our marriage. Do you really think we can come back from that?" She opened her mouth to respond but stopped, her gaze dropping to the floor as if the weight of my words was finally sinking in. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," she murmured. "But I still love you, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this right." I laughed, the sound hollow. "Make it right? Karen, you've already shattered what we had. This isn't something you can patch up with empty promises. Trust is gone, and without it, what's left?" Silence filled the room, thick with the unspoken truth neither of us wanted to acknowledge. Finally, she looked up, her eyes pleading. "For the kids, please. I know I've destroyed us, but they deserve a family. Can we try, at least for them?" The mention of our kids brought a fresh wave of anger and pain. They were the innocent ones in all of this, and I knew that if we split, their lives would be irrevocably changed. But I couldn't shake the memory of the emails, the lies, the betrayal. Staying together for the kids might protect them, but at what cost? "I need time," I said finally, my voice barely audible. "I can't just pretend everything's okay. And if you think we're going to sweep this under the rug for their sake, you're wrong. They deserve better than that." She nodded, swallowing hard. "I understand. I'll give you whatever time you need. Just, please don't give up on us yet." I walked away without another word, needing to be anywhere but near her. The walls of the house felt like they were closing in, suffocating me with memories of a life that was now tainted. I spent the day outside, taking long walks, trying to clear my head, but no amount of fresh air could chase away the bitterness that clung to me. The days turned into weeks, a blur of tense silences and hollow interactions. We managed a routine, keeping up appearances for the kids, but our home felt like a ticking time bomb. Every glance, every accidental touch, felt loaded with unspoken resentment. I avoided her as much as I could, leaving early, staying out late, doing everything in my power to keep my distance. Then one evening, as I sat alone in the living room, Karen walked in, holding a small envelope in her hands. She looked nervous, her fingers fidgeting as she extended it toward me. "What's this?" I asked, wary. "It's a letter," she said softly. "I wrote everything down, my side of the story, my regrets, my apology. I thought maybe it would help if you read it." I took the envelope, eyeing it suspiciously, but said nothing. Once she'd left, I opened it and started reading. Her words were raw, filled with self-loathing and remorse, but they didn't have the effect she hoped. Each sentence felt like an attempt to justify the unjustifiable, to explain away something that had no excuse. When I finished, I crumpled the paper, setting it aside. Her confession didn't erase the lies, didn't change the choices she'd made. Maybe she felt sorry now, but it didn't undo the damage. Our marriage was a fragile, fractured thing, and no amount of apologies could piece it back together. In the weeks that followed, she continued her attempts to bridge the gap, planning family outings, trying to rekindle our bond, but it all felt forced. I played along for the kids, keeping up the facade, but my heart wasn't in it. I couldn't shake the image of her with him, the betrayal etched in my mind like a scar that refused to fade. Then one evening, as I was putting the kids to bed, I heard a soft knock on my office door. Karen was there, looking more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. She reached out to touch my hand, but I pulled away, keeping a safe distance between us. "Please, just hear me out," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know I've lost your trust, and I know I've hurt you in ways I can't even begin to understand. But I want to be better, for you, for us, for the kids. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I stared at her, searching for any trace of the woman I once knew, the partner I'd thought would stand by me through anything. But all I saw was a stranger, someone who'd chosen to betray me rather than face her own doubts and fears. You had a choice, Karen, I said, my voice steady. You could have come to me, talked to me. Instead, you went behind my back. And I don't know if I can forgive that. She looked down, a tear slipping down her cheek. I know. I hope one day you'll find it in your heart to see me as the person I want to be, not the one I became. I watched her walk away, the finality of her words lingering in the air. For the first time, I realized that maybe, just maybe, there was no going back. In the weeks after our talk, Karen and I continued living in an uneasy, uncomfortable truce. We spoke when we needed to, coordinated schedules for the kids, and carefully avoided the raw nerve that sat between us, festering. Every so often, I'd catch her looking at me, a flicker of something like hope in her eyes, but I had nothing left to give. The wound was still too deep, and no amount of time seemed to numb it. One evening, a few weeks later, I found myself at home alone. Karen had taken the kids to her sister's for the weekend, giving us both some space. The silence in the house was deafening, so I poured myself a drink and sat in the quiet of the living room, letting my mind wander back to everything we'd been through. At some point, I made my way to the bookshelf in our bedroom. We'd filled it over the years with mementos, little reminders of trips we'd taken, old photos, trinkets from our early days together. In a fit of impulse, I opened one of the photo albums, running my fingers over the pictures from our wedding day, our honeymoon, the first house we'd bought, and the kids as babies. Each photo told a story I knew by heart, and yet it all felt like it had happened to someone else, a happier, more naive version of me. I put the album back, my chest tight with the weight of it all. That night, I lay awake in bed, wrestling with the realization that our marriage had been built on dreams that no longer held meaning. In my heart, I'd been holding on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to heal. But the truth was, we were strangers now, two people going through the motions, clinging to the skeleton of a life that no longer existed. The next morning, Karen and the kids came back earlier than expected. She looked surprised to see me sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of me. The kids ran up, their laughter filling the room, and for a moment, I let myself get lost in their joy. But Karen's presence felt like a heavy weight pressing down, and when the kids ran off to their rooms, the silence settled between us again. Karen took a deep breath, then looked at me with an intensity one hadn't seen before. "We can't keep doing this," she said quietly. "This pretending, this shell of a marriage. It's tearing us apart, and it's not fair to anyone, especially not the kids." I looked at her, feeling a strange sense of relief that she'd said the words I hadn't been able to. "I know," I said. "But I don't know how to move forward. I don't know what that even looks like anymore." Her eyes softened, and for a fleeting moment, she reached out, placing her hand over mine. "Maybe moving forward means letting go," she whispered. "Maybe it means accepting that we can't go back to who we were." The words hung in the air, raw and heavy, as the finality of them settled over us. There was a sadness in her eyes, a deep regret that mirrored my own, and I knew that she was right. We couldn't keep dragging ourselves through this nightmare, holding on to a life that had been broken beyond repair. In the days that followed, we started the quiet, painful process of separation. We kept it from the kids, working out the logistics behind closed doors, figuring out how to split our lives without shattering theirs. We agreed to joint custody, to keep the house until they were older, to do whatever we could to protect them from the harsh reality of what we were going through. One evening, Karen came to me with an unexpected suggestion. "Why don't we take one last trip together?" she asked, her voice tentative. "For the kids. Something to show them that we'll always be a family, even if we're not together anymore." I hesitated, the idea painful yet oddly comforting. Maybe a final trip could help us say goodbye to the life we'd built, to the dreams we'd once shared. Yeah, I said finally. Maybe that's what we need, a way to end this on our terms. So we packed up, rented a cabin by the lake, and spent a long weekend together, the four of us. We laughed, played games, made s'mores around the fire, and for a brief, bittersweet moment, it felt like we were whole again. The kids didn't suspect a thing, their joy filling the cabin with a warmth that was almost enough to make me forget the reality waiting for us back home. On our last night at the lake, after the kids were asleep, Karen and I sat by the water in silence, watching the moonlight ripple across the surface. She looked at me, her face etched with sadness. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "For everything. I wish I could take it all back." I looked at her, feeling a strange, hollow peace settle over me. "Me too," I replied. "But we both know it's too late." She nodded, wiping away a tear. We stayed there for a long time, saying the things we couldn't put into words, letting the silence speak for us. It was a farewell of sorts, a quiet, painful acknowledgement that our time had run out. The next morning, we packed up, loading the kids into the car as the sun rose over the lake. I felt a pang of sorrow, knowing that this was the last time we'd share a moment like this, the last time we'd pretend to be the family we'd once dreamed of being. On the drive home, Karen took the wheel, and I sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, lost in thought. At some point, I must have drifted off, lulled by the hum of the engine and the gentle sway of the car. But suddenly, a loud screech jolted me awake. I looked up just in time to see a flash of headlights bearing down on us. Karen screamed, her hands gripping the wheel, and I felt the car lurch to the side as she tried to swerve. But it was too late. The impact was a deafening roar, a violent jolt that threw us into darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was in a hospital room, the harsh fluorescent lights glaring above me. I tried to sit up, wincing at the pain that shot through my body. A nurse appeared, her face gentle, but her expression serious. Where's my family?" I managed to choke out, my voice weak. She looked away, her eyes filled with sorrow. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "Your wife, she didn't make it. Your children, they're gone too." The words hit me like a sledgehammer, shattering what was left of my world. I lay there, numb, the reality sinking in with a cold, merciless clarity. Everything I'd fought for, everything I'd loved, was gone in an instant. The family I'd been willing to let go of was ripped away from me, leaving nothing but an unbearable emptiness. In the days that followed, I went through the motions of planning their funeral, of saying goodbye to the only people I'd ever truly loved. Friends and family came, offering their condolences, but I was a ghost, barely aware of the world around me. As I stood by their graves, a bitter wind whipping through the cemetery, I felt the weight of everything I'd lost pressing down on me. The betrayal, the anger, the resentment, it all felt so small now, swallowed up by a grief so profound I could barely breathe. In the end, I was left alone, haunted by the memories of a life that had been shattered in ways I could never have imagined. The last moments we'd shared, the laughter, the warmth, the love, it was all I had left, a fragile echo of a family that would forever be out of reach.